Walter Higgins sat in his truck outside his son's house, rain drawing silver lines down the glass. He had driven that same road for 11 years. Every third Sunday, a casserole dish balanced on the passenger seat and engine grease still buried under his fingernails. Tonight the porch light was on, warm and yellow against the wet dark. Tonight, for the first time in 11 years, Walter did not want to go inside. Because tonight, through a gap in the curtains, he had watched his son's wife pace the living room with a phone pressed to her ear, laughing the wrong kind of laugh. The kind that made a grown man's stomach fold in on itself like a letter he already knew the contents of. He doesn't even know what he's sitting on, Mom. 12 million. 12. And he's out there fixing some neighbor's carburetor for $20, like it's still the Great Depression. Walter's hand froze on the door handle. David says once we get him to sign the guardianship papers, it's practically ours. We just need Dr. Renner to say his memory's slipping. Nobody's going to question it. He's a 68-year-old man who drives a truck older than our marriage. Walter did not open the door. He sat very still while the water traced the window like something inside him breaking slowly enough not to make a sound. Then, out of old habit, his hand drifted to the inside pocket of his jacket, to the folded envelope he had been carrying for 3 days. The one addressed to David, the one he still hadn't decided whether to deliver. He did not know it yet, but he would not need to deliver it. Not the way he planned. He put the truck in reverse and backed slowly out into the rain. They would not see him tonight, but soon they would see exactly what a quiet old mechanic was capable of, when the people he loved most tried to steal from him the one thing they didn't even know he had. To understand what Walter Higgins would do next, you first had to understand what he had already survived. Ellen died when David was 12, a Tuesday in March, an aneurysm that gave no warning and left no time for goodbyes. Walter remembered standing in the hospital hallway in his work boots, still smelling of motor oil, trying to figure out how a man was supposed to raise a boy alone on a mechanic's wage. He never remarried. He never even really tried. He poured every ounce of himself into Higgins Auto Repair, a 2-bay garage on Route 9, and into a boy who grew up watching his father come home every night with black crescents under his fingernails that no amount of soap could fully lift. He worked Saturdays. He worked most Sundays quietly, after church. He skipped his own knee surgery for 4 years so David's college tuition would clear on time. He never once told his son what those sacrifices cost him, because a father's love, in Walter's mind, was not supposed to come with a ledger attached. Then, 3 years ago, a letter arrived that changed everything without changing anything at all. His older brother Charlie, the one who'd left for Texas at 19 and rarely called, the one who'd built a fortune in oil leases and commercial real estate and never had children of his own, had died of a stroke in a Houston hospital room alone. And, in a will nobody expected, Charlie had left every cent of it to the only family he had left. $12 million. Liquid assets, mineral rights, 3 commercial properties. Delivered by a lawyer named Sam Delgado, an old friend from Walter's Army days, sitting across a kitchen table that still had a coffee ring shaped like a crescent moon. "You could retire tomorrow, Walter," Sam had said. Walter had looked around his small kitchen. The same yellow curtains Ellen sewed 30 years ago, the same chipped mug he drank his coffee from every morning, and said something Sam never forgot. "If I change everything about my life the second I get money, then the life I lived before wasn't worth much to begin with. Was it?" So Walter did something almost nobody in his position would have done. He said nothing. Not to his neighbors, not to his church, and, hardest of all, not to David. He kept working 3 days a week at the garage. He kept driving the same 14-year-old truck. He let the money sit, quietly growing under Sam's careful management, and he watched. Not out of suspicion, not at first, but out of a small, aching curiosity every parent eventually has to face. Would my son still love the man I am if he never learned about the man I have? There was a particular Tuesday, about a year into the secret, that Walter thought about often afterward. A transmission had failed on old Mrs. Alvarez's sedan, the only car she had to get to her dialysis appointments, and she didn't have the money for the part, let alone the labor. Walter could have written a check that afternoon and never felt it. Instead, he spent 6 hours on his back under that car, knuckles split, back aching, refusing payment beyond what she could manage, because some part of him understood that the $12 million wasn't really his money to spend carelessly. It was Charlie's last apology for all those lost years, and Walter intended to honor it the same patient, unhurried way he'd honored everything else in his life. One honest hour at a time. The early signs came slowly, the way rust does. At Christmas the year before last, Vanessa had laughed, not cruelly or so she thought, when Walter arrived in his good flannel shirt. "Dad, you know we do cocktail attire now, right?" David had said nothing, just an apologetic half-smile that somehow hurt more than if he'd laughed along. At Easter, David suggested gently, reasonably, the way betrayals often arrive, that Walter should think about selling the house. "It's too much space for one guy, Dad. And that lot's worth something now, with the new development going in." Walter had noticed, without saying so, that David never once asked whether his father was happy there. And at Vanessa's father's retirement dinner, Walter had been introduced to the assembled Whitfield family. Old money, country club money, with a single sentence. "This is my dad. He's a mechanic. Not he raised me alone. Not he worked 2 jobs so I could go to college. Just, he's a mechanic," said the way you might apologize for a stain on the tablecloth. Walter never mentioned Charlie's letter. He kept quietly funding a scholarship at the community college under a stranger's name. He kept an untouched account, one Sam Delgado knew about and no one else did, set aside for his goddaughter, Emily, David's cousin's daughter, a girl who reminded Walter so much of himself at 20, hands always busy, ambition always modest, gratitude always genuine. She was studying mechanical engineering on loans and double shifts at a diner. Walter had never told her about the money either. He was waiting. He didn't yet know for what. Now, sitting in his truck in the rain outside his son's house, he finally understood. The invitation came 4 days later, gold-edged and unusually warm for people who had spent the last several Christmases treating Walter like a coat rack. "Dad, we'd love for you to join us Saturday. Vanessa's parents are throwing their 40th anniversary at the club, and honestly, we want you there. Family." Walter went, not because he believed the sudden warmth, but because he wanted to look them in the eye and understand exactly how far they intended to go. The Cedarburg Country Club ballroom glittered with chandeliers and old money. Men in tailored blazers, women in dresses that cost more than Walter's monthly mortgage once had. He'd worn his one good sport coat, the navy one he kept for funerals and church, and standing at the entrance under all that gold light, he felt every bit the outsider they'd always quietly considered him to be. Vanessa met him at the door in a shimmering emerald gown. Air kissed his cheek and said, loud enough for 3 nearby couples to hear, "Everyone, this is David's father, Walter. He's finally letting us take care of him a little." Walter said nothing. He simply let the sentence hang there, ugly and revealing, the way a lie always sounds slightly wrong to the person telling it. He thought briefly of Ellen, of how she used to say that money didn't change people, it only removed the need to keep pretending. Standing in that ballroom, watching his daughter-in-law smile at him like a problem to be managed, he understood exactly what she'd meant. An hour in, David pulled him toward a quiet alcove near the bar, an unfamiliar attorney in tow, a slim, smiling man named Griggs who Walter had never met. "Dad, this is just a formality," David said, sliding a leather folder across a side table. "Power of attorney, just in case anything happens. You know, at your age. It protects you." Walter looked at the folder, then at his son's face, which would not quite hold his gaze. "Protects me from what exactly?" "From complications," Griggs offered smoothly. "Should your faculties ever come into question." "My faculties," Walter repeated, "are sitting right here, listening to every word." Vanessa's smile thinned at the edges. She leaned in, voice dropping to something sharp and practiced. "Walter, we all just think, given your age, and given how much money is now involved, that it would be safer for everyone if David had oversight. You wouldn't want people to think you're not entirely yourself anymore, would you?" There it was, spoken not in a private living room this time, but here, in front of David, in front of Griggs, in front of the low murmur of 100 wealthy strangers who would never know what those words had just cost. Walter set the folder down, unsigned, and folded his weathered hands over it. "No," he said quietly, "I don't need anyone's oversight. And I think you both already know that." The silence that followed was its own kind of confession. Vanessa recovered first, her voice brittle and bright for the benefit of anyone listening. "Well, given how overwhelmed you seem tonight, maybe it's best if you sit the next few family gatherings out, just until things settle." We'll let you know when you're ready. David said nothing. Not one word in his father's defense. He looked instead at his shoes, at the folder, at anything but the man who had once sat up 3 nights straight nursing him through pneumonia at age 6. Walter rose from the table, buttoned his old sport coat, and walked out of the Cedarbrook ballroom without another word, past the chandeliers, past the string quartet, past his son's silence, into the parking lot, where his 14-year-old truck sat alone under a flickering lamp. He did not cry. He did not slam the door. He simply sat behind a wheel for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, it was only to himself. "All right then," Walter said softly. "Let's see how deep this goes." Sam Delgado's law office hadn't changed in 20 years. Same oak desk, same smell of old paper and stronger coffee. He looked up when Walter walked in the following Monday morning, still in his garage coveralls, and set down his pen. "You look like a man who finally decided something," Sam said. "I need everything moved into the irrevocable trust," Walter said, sitting down across from him. "Today, if it can be done today." Sam didn't ask why. He already knew. 3 weeks earlier, a bank teller named Dolores, who'd known Walter since grade school, had quietly flagged an odd call to his account. A woman claiming to be David's assistant, requesting statements and asking pointed questions about incapacity clauses. Walter had thanked Dolores, said nothing to David, and simply waited to see how far the thread would unravel on its own. It had unraveled further than even he expected. The private investigator Sam hired, a careful, unhurried woman named Priya Nakamura, had spent 11 days documenting exactly what Walter suspected. 3 recorded conversations, obtained entirely within legal bounds, captured Vanessa's father, Harold Whitfield, discussing a favor with a Dr. Renner regarding a memory assessment report that hadn't technically been performed yet. Another recording caught Griggs, the attorney, advising Vanessa on the fastest path to guardianship once the documentation was in place. Walter listened all of it once, in Sam's office, hands folded, jaw tight, and did not ask to hear it a second time. "I want the trust restructured," he told Sam. "Irrevocable. No one, not David, not Vanessa, not any future attorney, gets discretionary control, ever. Emily is named successor trustee the day she finishes her engineering degree. Her tuition, her housing, her research fund, fully covered. Effective immediately, no conditions." "And David?" Walter was quiet for a moment. "David gets what the original will already allows. Not $1 more and, this matters, Sam, not $1 less either. This isn't about punishing my son. It's about making sure nobody can ever again decide what he's worth based on what he might one day inherit." There was one more thing. Weeks earlier, quietly, through a shell entity Sam had set up years ago for exactly this kind of contingency, Walter had acquired a controlling stake in Whitfield and Associates, Harold Whitfield's own real estate investment firm, currently stretched thin on a development loan nobody outside the boardroom knew was 2 payments from default. Walter hadn't done it out of spite. He'd done it because Charlie, in his own gruff way, had taught him one thing from the oil fields of Texas: never walk into a fight without already knowing how it ends. He also placed one phone call, brief, calm, unemotional, to the state medical board, forwarding Priya's documentation regarding Dr. Renner. None of it was loud. None of it was cruel. It was simply Walter Higgins doing what he had always done best, working quietly, methodically with his hands and his patience until the job was finished right. There was one more call Walter made that week, one Sam didn't learn about until later. He'd phoned Emily directly, not to warn her, not to explain the trust, but simply to ask how her semester was going, whether the diner shifts were wearing her down, whether she still wanted to build bridges the way she used to talk about as a girl, sketching them on napkins at Sunday dinners nobody else paid much attention to. She'd laughed, tired but warm, and said yes, still bridges, always bridges. Walter had hung up smiling for the first time in weeks. Whatever happened with David, whatever became of the Whitfields and their country club and their forged paperwork, he understood clearly now what money like Charlie's was actually meant to build. Not walls, not leverage, something a person could actually walk across. "You know," Sam said, sliding the final papers across the desk for signature, "most men in your position would be angrier." Walter signed his name, steady and unhurried. "I raised that boy with these 2 hands, Sam. Anger's not going to fix what's broken in him, but the truth might. The family meeting David scheduled 3 weeks later was meant to be quiet, contained, decisive, a quick signature in a private room at Griggs's office, guardianship finalized before Walter fully understood what was happening. Instead, Walter arrived with Sam Delgado at his side, and calmly asked that Harold and Vanessa's mother be present as well. David hesitated, sensing the air had shifted, but agreed. Griggs began smoothly, sliding the same folder across the table. "Just a signature, Walter, and we can put all of this behind. I'd like everyone to hear something first," Walter said. Sam pressed play on a small recorder. Harold Whitfield's voice filled the room, discussing the favor with Dr. Renner as though it were of business courtesy. Then Greg's own voice, advising Vanessa on the fastest legal route to controlling $12 million that was never his to control. Harold's face went the color of old ash. Vanessa's mouth opened, then closed, no sound emerging. David simply stared at the table, at his own hands, as though seeing them clearly for the first time. "The trust was finalized 3 weeks ago," Walter said quietly. "Irrevocable. No guardianship, real or fabricated, changes a single dollar of it. Dr. Renner's board license is currently under review." And Harold, Walter turned not unkindly toward the man who had once introduced him as the mechanic. "You might want to speak to your loan officer. Whitfield and Associates has a new controlling partner as of last month. Me." The room did not erupt. It simply collapsed, quietly, the way houses built on bad foundations always do. Not with an explosion, but a slow, final settling into the truth. Vanessa's mother reached for her purse, murmured something about needing air, and left without another word to her own daughter. Harold sat frozen, already calculating. Walter guessed how many phone calls it would take to save the development loan before Monday's board meeting, calls that, thanks to a controlling partner he hadn't seen coming, would no longer matter nearly as much as he thought. Griggs simply gathered his folder, said nothing, and showed himself out, already composing in his head whatever explanation he'd owe the state bar. David finally looked up, eyes wet, voice barely holding. "Dad, I didn't. I should have said something at the club. I should have stopped them. You just stayed quiet," Walter said, "the same way I did for 3 years. The difference is, I stayed quiet because I was testing whether you'd love me without the money. You stayed quiet because you were hoping I wouldn't notice you didn't." David had no answer for that. There wasn't one. Walter stood, buttoned his coat the same way he had at Cedarbrook, and turned toward the door, then paused. "The trust isn't going away, David. Your inheritance is still there, same as Charlie always intended, same as I always intended. But it's not coming early, and it's not coming through fear or forged paperwork. If you want a relationship with me going forward, it starts with Sunday dinners again. Casserole, my kitchen, no lawyers in the room. We'll see where it goes from there." 2 months later, Walter Higgins was exactly where he'd always been most comfortable. Underneath the '98 Silverado at Higgins Auto Repair, grease under his fingernails, a country radio station humming low in the background. The community college scholarship fund he'd quietly endowed years earlier was formally renamed that spring, the Ellen Higgins Memorial Trade Scholarship, funded permanently at $4 million. Emily started her final semester of engineering with every bill paid, and not one condition attached. David came by that Sunday, and the one after, and the one after that, not to discuss money, but simply to sit at his father's kitchen table in the same kitchen with the same yellow curtains, learning slowly what it meant to earn something instead of expecting it. Vanessa did not come. Whether that silence would ever mend was a question Walter no longer felt the need to rush an answer to. Some things he'd learned could not be repaired on anyone's schedule but their own. Walter never spoke of the $12 million again, not out of secrecy this time, but because he no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. He'd already gotten his answer to the question that mattered, the one he'd carried quietly for 3 long years. It hadn't been the answer he'd hoped for, but it had been the truth, and Walter Higgins had always believed a hard truth, honestly earned, was worth more than any comfortable lie. Some inheritances are measured in dollars, in deeds, in numbers on a bank statement that most people will never see. Walter Higgins had spent a lifetime proving something quieter and far more durable, that the only inheritance truly worth guarding is a name, and the dignity of never once letting anyone convince you it was for sale, not for $12 million. Not for anything at all.